Bachelors begin again. Part 1. Niland started to stir gently. He could faintly see the glow of light on the other side of his closed eyelids and feel the gentle rise and fall of his brother's sleepy breathing behind him. The vargin man inhaled deeply as he rolled over. He could feel a body super close to him. Assuming it was his brother, he threw an arm out over the other man, sleepily dreaming. He hadn't been awake for 5 minutes and was already trying to bother his brother. As his arm relaxed over the form, the mass stretched. It was clear that his back was facing Niland. More stretching. Niland's eyes popped open and he sat up. On the floor beside the bed, partially tangled in the sheets, was RSA. He sat up, rubbing his head and groaning as he tried to gather what just happened. Bastard! The sleepy, silver-haired man growled as he looked at his brother. Niland was baffled as he looked at the mess that was under the blankets, still rising and falling gently as they breathed. Say put his chin on the edge of the bed, a frown on his face. Slowly, Niland smiled as he started to pull up the blankets. He had a guess on who it was. He flipped up the upper edge of the blankets, only to uncover a butt and feet. The man blinked, slightly confused. He uncovered a bit more of his sleeping person to expose the rest of their lower half curled up into a tight ball. How? How does he do this? RSA muttered as he shook his head and flopped back under the floor with a loud thud. Niland's form twitched violently at the noise, and the blankets rose slightly as he lifted his head up. Why do we even get to rooms? Say growled from the floor. The sheets soon started to slide off the bed as he wrapped himself up on the floor. A loud groan echoed from Loon as he grabbed the blankets, separating it from the sheet and keeping himself covered. Because Moki is a bed whore, Niland responded as he recovered Loon's feet and stood up from the bed. From the floor on the other side of the bed, Say groaned and let out a heavy, protesting sigh. Tay hesitated, but then proceeded to get dressed. Those two could sleep more if they wanted. He didn't care. What he did care about was whether or not Baylin knew that Loon had changed rooms in the middle of the night. Once he was dressed, Niland grabbed the extra key to Baylin and Moki's room and left his. Quietly, he shut the door behind him, turned to the door just across the hall, and knocked lightly before unlocking the door and walking in. On the far wall, facing the door, was an old couch, and from it, Baylin lifted his head. Niland stood just in the entrance of the room, looking at Baylin, confused for a moment. "What's wrong?" Baylin asked in a sleepy voice as he sat up and rubbed his face. Niland stepped further into the room and looked at the large bed that inhabited one of the corners. Sprawled out in the center was Bekah, still fast asleep. "I was trying to figure out how and why Loonson was in our room this morning," Tay finally said with a smile. Baylin's feet shifted off the couch and onto the floor as he fully sat up and let out a sleepy sigh. The eldest bachelor rubbed his face again as he let out a heavy yawn. "Why? Probably because Makota decided to stretch his legs last night," Fayley said as his arms flopped down to rest on his knees. "How he got in there? I don't know." He looked at the extra key to the other room that still sat in the end table next to the couch. Niland laughed to himself. Loonson always seemed to be the master of breaking out of or into places. "Well, what are your plans today, Sunshine?" Niland asked as he stood up and started to fold the blanket he had been using. Niland watched him for a moment before answering. "Not sure. I know you were planning on spending time with Miss Alicia, and I'm sure brother will go with you." He snorted to himself, and Baylin grinned softly. "You and Makota could go for a hike to the hot spring Lady Alicia told us about last night." Niland nodded as he thought about that plan. He had been itching to go on a good hike, and he knew Makota had been wanting to go for a good swim, and that Baylin was not thrilled with the idea of ocean swimming. It was not a terrible idea, but that left one important person out of plans. And what about Loonson? Tay asked softly. Both of the older males paused and glanced at Makota as the youngster let out a groan, rolled onto his back, stretched his arms skyward, then flopped totally sprawled out once more. He's an adult. He can decide for himself what he wants to do, Fayley stated strongly. Taylor laughed happily as Moki charged at them, his feet slapping the ground like a pump. The youngster hadn't gone back to his hominid form since they left town, and he was still doing laps around them, as well as racing ahead before charging back. Can we take a break? Loonson whined from behind Talon. Tay turned and walked backwards so he could look at his friend. If you didn't want to walk, you shouldn't have come. Loonson's face twisted into one of pain and offense, but then he smiled slightly. But I wanted to come, he said warmly, as he lengthened his stride to slightly catch up with Tay. Tay rolled his eyes as he turned back around to walk normal. The vargin felt Loonson grab at his shirt, but ignored the smaller man and kept his eyes on the still overly excited Moki. Suddenly, Talon had a force on his shoulder and felt a mass clinging to his back. The man let out a grunt as he stumbled forward, but caught himself before he fell into the shin-deep snow. Bless the stars, Loonson, at least warn me! He laughed as he spoke and adjusted his footing to compensate for the little extra weight in his back. Loon laughed with accomplishment as he rested his head on Tay's shoulder. One of the black-haired vargin's arms was wrapped around Tay's neck, while the other hung limply down the man's chest. "You're a pain in the butt," Talon grumbled. Loon only made a slight sound with a shrug, but otherwise didn't move. "I see the lake!" Moki called from the top of the hill. Talon, now in his feral form, with Loonson still draped over his back, looked up at the excited Makota. "Is the swim worthy?" he barked, his tail swaying happily as he slowly climbed up the hill. Despite the extra weight of Loonson and the snow, they were still making good time, and he had plenty of energy for a good swim. "Doesn't matter," Moki called, as he finally shifted into his two-legged form again and vanished over the side of the hill. Talon glanced over his shoulder at Loonson as Loon sat up from his laying position. "He better not swim fully clothed this time," Loon said softly, a small smile on his face. Tay laughed loudly for a moment as he remembered the last time that they all went swimming. Bekah had jumped into the water, fully clothed. Not only did he ruin a perfectly good pair of shoes, he stained a white shirt in mud and almost got dragged to the bottom of the pond by the pure weight of the soggy fabric. Bayland had been furious with him for days over it. "He's not that dumb," Tay finally said as he pushed himself into a trot. He was suddenly eager and excited to see and feel the water, and as he climbed up over the crest of the hill, he paused, wonder-struck. Below them, just down the other side of the hill that they stood upon, was a large, crystal-clear lake. The water reflected a vibrant blue similar to the shade of the sky on a cloudless day, and even from their perch above the waters, both Tay and Loon could see fish, otter, and other creatures swimming below its surface. Steam radiated from the water's surface, explaining why it was not frozen, while there was snow all around it. Loon slid himself from Talon's back, and the vargin man shifted back into his human-esque form. After taking in the surroundings a bit more, they started down the hill after their companion, who they could no longer see. When they reached the water's smooth pebble beach, they stopped and looked around. It was quiet and peaceful. Which was up? Where was Makota? Loon lightly tugged at Tay's shirt, grabbing his attention, and pointed to a pile of clothes on a large rock just feet from the water's edge. "Told you he learned," Talon said as he started to strip himself down. "You did. I'm impressed." Loon responded as he removed his own jacket a little less enthusiastically. "Are you actually going to swim with us, Sansen?" Loonson about jumped out of his skin, causing Talon to dance away in surprise. Bekah let out a shrill, evil laugh as he bounded back into the warm water. Once he was about waist deep, he stopped, dropped so that the water was up to his chin. He sat there, smiling at his older packmates, his eyes bright with mischief. "You pest!" Talon growled as he laughed and started stripping at a quicker pace. By the time the lighter-haired vargin started running down the cool pebble beach, he was hopping awkwardly between strides, trying to pull off his underwear. Bekah let out a yell and a laugh as he turned and started to swim further out into the warm lake. The moment Talon hit the water, his stride slowed, and he was soon trudging after the youngster at a slower and noisy pace. By the time Talon was up to his elbows in water, Bekah was yards away, treading water to keep his head up. A large grin was spread across his face as he watched Talon. "I am faster than you, brother," Loki called to Tay, making the older vargin laugh. Faster, better looking, soon to be stronger too. Talon panted as he sank into the water, letting it lick up his neck and under his chin. Slowly, Talon turned around to look back at the shore. He was shocked to see Loonson waist deep in the water, arms crossed over his chest with a hand on each shoulder, as he almost nervously wandered into the warm lake. The dark-haired man stopped as the water licked up just above his belly, and his gaze shifted to look at the other two. "So, we walked through knee-deep snow." He paused as he lowered himself into the warm water, flinching slightly as he stepped on a sharply shaped stone, to stand in a warm puddle. Loon let out a deep sigh as he relaxed onto his knees, allowing the warm water to embrace him. Talon laughed. "First of all," he moved closer towards the Loonson without raising up out of the water, "I did almost all of the walking. You got to lounge." When he finally was within arm lengths of his companion, he reached out and poked Loon in the chest with 2 fingers. Loon flinched and put his hand over his chest where Tay poked. The dark-haired vargin man frowned for a moment, but then let a cat-like smile form gently on his lips. "It's what I do best," he said happily. His eyes shifted to Bekah behind Talon. Tay turned to watch as the youngest pack member walked slowly through the water, chasing minnows and other small creatures just under the glassy water. Balin walked with Arasay in almost silence. Bay occasionally looked at his companion, only to notice that he was deep in nervous thought. As they wandered out of the center of town and towards the smaller homes, Balin lightly shoved into his packmate. "What's on your mind, Arasay?" he asked in a warm, caring tone. Say blinked a few times, as if slightly startled by being spoken to, but then shrugged with a nervous wrinkle of his nose. "Nothing." Bay smiled gently at Say's obvious lie. It was rare for Say to not be thinking about something, but it was unusual for him to be so focused on those thoughts. "Uh-huh," the eldest vargin man finally said with a very unconvinced tone. Say glared at him, but then just smiled. "Just keep your cool. I'll throw." He paused as he corrected himself. Lady Alicia has always been one to tease when the chance arises. It's all in good fun, but if you don't give her a chance, yeah. Say lightly shoved his elder companion a bit further away from him. The two laughed as they fell back into stride. The younger male let out a heavy sigh, which made Bay look at him one more time, a bit concerned. Arasay inhaled deeply, composing himself, and soon walked with much more relaxed than just moments earlier. The two males walked up to a cabin and paused. Both of their noses twitched as they sniffed the air. It was most definitely the house of Alicia, but the traces of other scents made them hesitate. Balin knew there were probably other people over. Alicia had said that there was always some of her old friends from the military days over, but he wasn't sure if he was really ready to meet the former alpha female's friends. Well, it was too late now. Tap, 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 tap. Balin knocked lightly on the standard wooden door and stepped back away from the doorway. Say rested his head on Bay's shoulder as he watched the door from behind him. There was a loud thump from inside the cabin, making Bay raise his brows. Shortly after the thump, a screech and a laugh. Concerning, RSA muttered with a snort. Balin nodded as he laughed. It wasn't really that concerning. When Alicia was younger, she was a rambunctious and always played fighting with her twin brother. The brunette vargin couldn't help but smile as he remembered the youth he shared with her and his siblings. Those were nicer times, but there was nothing more than distant memories now. The door clicked open, and Balin stood taller as he pushed the nostalgia away. Alicia stood in her doorway, her hair wild and her tank top disheveled. The young woman smiled happily, a giggle escaping her as she tried to collect herself. "Don't just stand there, we're playing blind find," she said as she laughed again. Balin blanked, confused, but did as she said and walked into the house. RSA walked almost on Bay's heels as they entered. "What is blind find?" Balin asked finally as he stopped in the cabin entryway. Alicia shut the door behind them, grinning wickedly. "Everyone stand around the room. You can move, but you can only move 1 foot at a time. The person, it, is blindfolded and has to find everyone." She slowly moved past the young 2 men and towards the hallway, walking backwards so that she could speak to them. RSA smiled more and more as he watched Alicia get more and more excited. Her joy was contagious, and he soon found himself excited to play the stupid game with her. "This is it right now, but we will restart the round since you guys finally decided to show up." Alicia's gaze met RSA's, and she winked to him, making his heart jump into his throat. Alicia turned with a twirl and led them to the back of the cabin, which was more like a small house where the living room resided. The 2 newcomers paused in the doorway and into the living room, taking a moment to inspect who all they were joining. Alicia paused a few feet from them. Her eyes softened as she smiled and walked over to one of the people. The young man was familiar to Balin, and he clearly recognized Bay, for he stood up and walked over to him with a proud look on his face. "It's been a long time, Balin." Balin smiled as he quickly embraced his old travel partner. "Glad to see you still at her side, Trinskal." Say watched the 2 as they traded greetings, smiling. He had heard stories from Balin about traveling to other worlds with the alpha female and her Skalat, but he never thought he would get to meet them. It was interesting to see how Bay and them interacted, especially since it was different interactions than he was used to seeing from the Bachelor Pack's eldest male. Trinskal turned to Say, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Trinskal," he said simply, his voice husky and slightly bitter. "RSA." He lowered his head politely, but said no more. Trin looked him over, frowning as he did so, but then turned and wandered to one of the couches and flopped into it. Alicia watched him, but then rolled her eyes and motioned to the next person in the room. The man she motioned to was, oddly enough, similar in appearance to Trinskal, but clearly human. His face was soft, but regal, with honey eyes and short amber hair. The young human man stood a few inches shorter than Say, which almost made him puff up in pride. It wasn't often that he actually met someone shorter than him. "That is Dason." The young man smiled and waved at the 2 bargain men. "Nice to meet you guys, though I thought you said there were more of them, Allie." Dason turned to look at Alicia, and she glanced at him, but then back to Balin. Talon, Lunson, and Makota went to some hot spring that Lady Alicia told us about. They had some energy to burn. Bay explained with an amused smile. Dason smiled and nodded as he accepted the response and looked at Alicia's next person of interest. This young man was more elegant and feminine than Dason and Trin, with hair dyed vibrant blue and white. His bright purple eyes inspected them closely, but his face was soft and friendly. Bekah, or Mickey as we call him, Alicia said simply. The blue-haired man said nothing, but smiled and held his hand up in a brief greeting. Finally, Alicia sat on the arm of a chair next to a quite large man with tan skin and shaggy dark hair. "This is Mitz." The man watched her, his eyes admiring her movements, then looked at the two vargin men and smiled a large, goofy but friendly smile. "Cool to meet more of the General's people," he said, his voice almost booming. Balin muttered a greeting to each of them, his smile warm. He kind of wanted to make friends. RSA inhaled a bit briefly as his eyes flicked mix over. How the man looked at Alicia and how she sat on the arm of his chair did not get past him. Was she associated with him? He had not smelled his scent on her the other night, so if she was, they were not quite that close. He clenched his jaw slightly and steadily rolled his shoulders. Quickly, his blue eyes darted to Trinstall, and his mind worked quickly, calculating the risks of the game he was playing with Alicia. The young male's eyes darted back to Alicia and met her gaze. He noticed her nose wrinkle slightly as she smiled, and her brows twitched with interest, but she soon looked away from him and to the rest of the group. Was that a sign that the game was still on? Say inhaled deeply again and lowered his gaze as he tried to compose himself once more. Balin didn't seem to notice, which probably meant no one else did either. It was better that way. "Are we ready to play?" The voice that spoke made both Say and Bay look over at the blue-haired man, a bit surprised. "Whoa!" Say choked slightly, surprised at the deep tone that came from the elegant and quiet man. Bay lightly elbowed the young male. Say cleared his throat and lowered his gaze. "Sorry," he said softly. Nikan looked at him, his eyes bright with curiosity and his head cocked slightly, but his attentions were soon grabbed by Alicia and Mitz, standing from their chair. "Let's play," Alicia growled out playfully. Balin laughed loudly as he flopped into one of the chairs, pushed to the edge of the room. He had lost track of how long and how many rounds of this game they had been playing. What he did know was that after this round, he would have to see if he could find the other three. But he wasn't in that much of a rush. In fact, he was rather amused by Say wandering around the room slowly, blindfold tied around his face. Alicia and Nikki were the last two in this round, and the silver-haired man was struggling to find them. Bekah sat, his feet curled up to his chest on top of the coffee table, a sly smile on his easeful face. A few paces away, Alicia had shoved herself far into the corner between the wall and the fireplace. She sat on her knees, grinning wildly as she watched Say fumble around. "This is no fair," RSA laughed as he ran his hands along the couch, blindly reaching for people. "Turn around," Jason said as he laughed and tried to lead Say away from Nikki and towards Alicia. RSA hesitated, but then slowly turned, his hands outstretched. "I feel the heat from the fire," Say said quietly. "We won't let you touch the fire," Balin said as he got himself comfortable in the chair that he now claimed as his. Say nodded, accepting Bay's words over everyone else's. Balin, after all, was his pack's little leader. Alicia covered her mouth as she laughed, trying to keep the sound as quiet as she possibly could. Say was slowly getting closer, and all she could do was push herself further back into the corner and hope he didn't reach past the fireplace. "Are you sure I won't hit the fire?" RSA was just a foot away from Alicia, his hand pointing towards the fire in its heat. "I promise," Balin said through his laughter. RSA's nose wiggled as he thought. He dropped to his hands and knees and started inching forward slowly. Alicia shifted back further and sucked in as much as she could as the silver-haired man's hand got closer and closer. Dark-haired woman had to bite her tongue to keep from laughing and held her breath to prevent any other sounds from escaping. RSA paused, as if debating if there was really anyone hidden in this direction, but then lunged forward. Alicia let out a yelp of surprise and jumped slightly, but then burst out laughing as RSA grabbed her. "And Nikki wins this round!" Mitz laughed the moment Alicia was snagged. Alicia laughed from her spot as Say pulled his blindfold off with one hand, still gripping her leg. "Come now, Arlan. At least buy me dinner first." the young woman crooned playfully when his face was uncovered. Only then did the young vargin realize that he was grasping the upper part of Allie's thigh. RSA froze up for a moment, his face turning from excited rosy to bright red. He stammered as he released her leg and flopped back into the sitting position. Sorry, Miss Alicia. He felt his face burn with embarrassment. Alicia leaned forward, her eyes sly and playful. We are vargin. We like it rougher. She whispered. Say felt himself burning, even hotter now. Alicia smiled proudly at his red face, put her hand on his shoulder, and used him to push herself into a standing position. The young male watched her, then looked to Baylin, who was happily talking to Nikki and Trim. He exhaled in relief and pushed himself to a stand. I should probably go find the other three before it gets too late. They'll probably be ready for food as well. Baylin stated as he stood from his seat. They are at Warm Lake? Alicia asked as she took a drink of water. That's where they said they were going, RSA said before Baylin could react. Baylin looked at him, a bit surprised by how confident he was becoming, but nodded in agreement. I can go get him, Alicia said with little inflection to her words. Say and Bay glanced at each other, confused. It'll only take a few minutes, she hummed as she grabbed a sweatshirt from the back of one of the chairs. How? Isn't it way up the mountain? Bay asked. Instead of answering him, Alicia smiled and winked as she walked out. Wouldn't this be better to do in normal form? Lunson asked as he watched the nude man run through the snow. Moki laughed as he flopped into a snowdrift and started making a snow angel. Don't burst his bubble, Loon, Talon muttered as he raised his head a bit more out of the water. The moment he was done speaking, he lowered himself so that the water was just level under his nose, but over his mouth. Then Brunette Vargin sighed heavily as his eyelids grew heavier. Yipe! Yipe! What the hell is that? Makoto's yelps both made Loon and Talon jump to their feet as the younger male ran towards them with a couple brightly colored flying creatures following him. Makoto practically threw himself back into the water and was quick to get back to his packmates. The youngster hid himself behind Talon, peering over his broad shoulders to watch the colorful creatures as they seemed to have multiplied in numbers. The trio stood perfectly still, ignoring the chilling air on their damp skin as they watched the small cloud of creatures as they flew about. Slowly, Lunson moved forward, his eyes bright with interest. He moved slowly and quietly, trying not to grab the creature's attention, as he did his best to inspect them and figure out what they were. When the vargin was about halfway between his packmates and the creatures, he stumbled, creating a slight splash. He froze, his eyes locked on the creatures. One seemed to be interested by the sound, and with a blink of an eye, changed its direction and flew towards the vargin man. Lunson flinched as a flash of blue came towards him, then veered away. When he raised his head again, he noticed the little creature circling him. The little creature got closer until it gently landed on his bare shoulders, letting out soft beeping and bubbling noises. Lunson's eyes inspected the small, lizard-like creature, and he smiled as he noticed its shimmering, fiery marks on its blue skin. It's a winged lizard, Lunson said with an amused voice as he looked at his companions. Moki was quick to move from behind Talon to Lunson, now curious of the creatures that had scared him so badly. Vitamin D, Lunson said as he noticed a small collar on the creature. It's someone's pet? Moki asked in surprise as he looked up at the other creatures. The rest of the small pack of lizard beasts were flying over their heads now, chattering and singing as the sun reflected off of their multicolored skins. A black and gold-winged lizard darted down and landed on Lunson's other side, twining his tail with its blue companions. This one's collar says, Chim. Loon laughed slightly as he looked at the other flying beasts. I like that one, Moki said happily as a mottled cream and black one darted past. Noticing the attention it was getting, The little creature Moki had pointed out darted to the young bargain man and landed on his shoulders, crooning and chattering loudly. Cookies and cream. Makoto laughed happily as he reached up and pet the little beast. What are they? He asked. Both Loon and Tay shrugged. They kinda look like dragons, Taylin finally said, as a vibrant orange and blue one landed on him. He laughed happily as he pet the creature's blinding colored skin. Suddenly, all of the little creatures went dead silent, then started chattering and shrieking at a louder and more intense volume than before. The three bargain men lowered themselves in surprise, their ears slightly pained by the loud and sharp sound. A shadow overhead made the bargain flinch down even more, watching the massive, dark shape with wide eyes. Now that is a dragon, Loonson said softly as they all huddled together, trying to prepare themselves for anything. The massive black dragon circled the lake once, then lowered itself towards the ground. Its wings pumped heavily, creating massive waves on the water and pushing three bargain further out from shore. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. The beast landed surprisingly gently, but the ground still shook as his feet sank into the troubled shore of the lake. Three bargain were silent, their breath caught in their throats as they watched the pitch-black dragon slowly close its wings. It then turned its massive head towards them, showing off its crimson and midnight purple marks. As the beast settled, the little lizard dragon creatures reappeared, chattering even more excitedly at something on the black dragon's back. They waited, hearts pounding. A shape bounced and climbed from the dragon's back, to its wings, to its leg, then the ground. Only then did the three bargain breathe again. Lady Alicia! Makoto barked happily as he stood up in happiness. Taylin reached up and pulled the younger bargain down, back into the water. The former High Altus doesn't need to see your family jewels, Moki, Taylin said in a whisper as Loonson started to laugh hysterically. You guys ready to come off the mountain? Faylin figured you would want fed. Alicia walked towards the water's edge, but stopped short as she noticed their pile of clothing. It will be a cold flight back if you don't get dressed first, she said as she glanced back at them, then turned and slowly wandered back to the massive dragon. The trio hesitated, but once they noticed Alicia sit on the dragon's foreleg, her back to them, they started to venture forward towards their clothing. Sorry I flashed you, Miss Alicia, Makoto said as he pulled on his pants. From her seat on Nightmare's leg, Alicia smiled and laughed. I've seen more of you three today than I needed, but that's alright. I forgot how open our kind are raised to be, she said as she leaned forward and rubbed some dirt out of between a few of the dragon's scales. Just so you know, Taylin said with a large, cheesy grin, I am the larger brother. Alicia paused what she was doing, and Tay could see her shoulders shaking as she laughed. He smiled, feeling a bit of accomplishment. Taylin loved making people laugh, and knowing the interest his brother had in this woman only made it more worth it. Should I tell him you said that? Alicia questioned, her ears twisting on her head towards them. Loonson, the first one, fully redressed, walked slowly but happily over the Nightmare, his eyes wide and bright as he looked up at the beast. No, don't. It will turn into a competition between Tay-Tay and Parker, Loon said, as he hesitantly reached out to touch Nightmare's leg. Nightmare blinked slowly, but let out a soft and friendly grumble as he lowered his head to the bargain man. Oh, I feel like that would be amusing. Alicia hummed as she glanced at Loonson as he started to climb on Nightmare. No, lots of dancing. And if they're competing over Makoto, we don't need details, Taylin said as he almost tackled the youngest man and covered his mouth with his hand. Just shut up and let Lady Alicia take us back to the town, alright? Loki looked at Taylin, then nodded with a small grin.